Good evening and welcome to our first event of the Fall Mary Ann Key Book Club season. I'm Christy Mulligan. I'm the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Coordinator for the Hennepin County Library and a member of the Mary Ann Key Book Club planning team. It is so wonderful to have so many folks joining us for tonight's special event. Tonight's program will be a conversation between Dr. Tarshia Stanley and Myron Medcalf during the first hour. There's time for audience Q&A, so please submit your questions to our chat moderators in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Closed captions are also available. Just click on the arrow next to the CC icon and select Show Subtitles. At the end of the program, we'll have a brief survey link in the chat box and would greatly appreciate you sharing your feedback with us. It helps us improve future programs and tell the story of the Mary Ann Key Book Club. And now I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. This land and the Dakota people belong together. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Dakota sovereignty and aspire to hold ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. The Mary Ann Key Book Club, including tonight's event, is made possible with generous funding support from the Friends of Hennepin County Library. We want to thank the Friends, and we also want to thank our partner, the Star Tribune. And now I am very excited to introduce Dr. Tarshia Stanley. Dr. Stanley is Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Wagner College in Staten Island, New York. Her areas of focus are film and media studies and African American speculative fiction. She edited a volume for the Modern Language Association's teaching series titled Approaches to Teaching the Works of Octavia E. Butler, which was the 2021 recipient of the Idaho State University Department of English and Philosophy's Teaching Literature Book Award. Prior to joining Wagner College, Dr. Stanley was Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Sciences at St. Catherine University. Joining Dr. Stanley in conversation is Myron Medcalf. Myron is a senior college basketball reporter, nationally syndicated radio host with ESPN, columnist for the Star Tribune, and a very valued partner in the planning and delivery of the Mary Ann Key Book Club. Welcome, Dr. Tarshia Stanley, and welcome, Myron Medcalf.
Thank you, Christy, for that wonderful introduction. Dr. Stanley, it is definitely an honor to be able to speak with you. I always think about what my great-great-great-grandmother would have thought about this book club. She was enslaved in the 1840s and 50s in Georgia and Alabama, and just denied so many opportunities. But yet her life laid the groundwork for what I hope has been an educational opportunity for the people who joined us in this book club. So we're definitely honored to have your presence for this particular book. I guess I have so many questions about Octavia Butler, so many questions about this book, which is just such an incredible read. But I think I want to start with Octavia Butler. Where does this material come from? I mean, a lot of people have written these sci-fi sort of dystopian novels. That's a popular genre. But she writes it from a perspective and angle that made her stand out. Where does that come from?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me this evening. Very happy to talk about Butler. So Octavia Butler, began writing science fiction when she was a child. There's a famous story about her having watched a movie, Devil Girl from Mars, and being just really upset about how poorly it was written. And she thought to herself at 12, 13 years old, I can do better than that. And she started to write. From a family who didn't quite understand what it meant to support yourself as a writer, to live your life as a writer, yet, she managed to continue to pursue her dream. I think an incredibly deep thinker, a person who spent her childhood in the library, which was a safe space for her, really reading and dreaming and thinking about other worlds and better worlds. and certainly a woman, an African-American woman who understood her times, our times, the economy, understood culture, and saw a way to, I think, combine her love of the future and what the future could be with what we needed to hear in the present.
So many people, I think, read this book, and you could turn on any cable news station right now, and you'd see everything that she talked about. How did she feel about being viewed as prophetic? Which I think so many people today look at her work and go, wow, this is 30 years ago. She was talking to us about the future to come.
I think all of her work, people focus on parable, but all of her work really has a unique perspective on human nature. And I think she was just a master student of human nature. She understood who we were and what we were capable of. Both the negative things we're capable of, but also what we can do, the positive things we're capable of. And so I think for her, writing about human nature was her way of asking us to be our best selves. I think for me, studying her interviews and the things that she wrote, I don't think that she would have considered herself particularly prophetic. Of course, she's incredibly intelligent, but she says in her work, she says in her interviews that you too can predict the future if you extrapolate where we are today, 30 years from now, and we don't fix it. You too can guess what's going to happen if we don't make a change. And so, in my own work, I like to kind of help people think through, why do we want to call her prophetic? Does it somehow allow us not to be responsible for envisioning the future? Is it a special gift that only certain people get, or is it a responsibility that we all have?
I think that's profound, the idea that if you maybe call her prophetic, then you can kind of sort of remove yourself in so many ways. This is a book, before we get into some of the specifics, where even as someone, I know I read a lot, and obviously a lot of people at our book club do as well, you have to digest this one a little bit. I read this in sort of spoonfuls, I think, as you're trying to digest the things that are happening. For some people, there are triggering events. For some people to read this, it's the material's incredible, but also it may be difficult to read. What advice do you have to those folks who are looking at this book, and as profound as it is, are sort of wondering, how do you work your way through it with some of those dynamics attached to it?
I think read it in pieces, like you say, and just read it, put it down, go away, digest what you've read and come back. I think read it with other people. It's not, people sometimes sort of think of it as, oh, I'll take it with me on vacation. It's not a beach read. It is work. It is, you read this because you want to confront the reality of who we are on this planet, but also yourself. And I would just say, you have to know that's the kind of work you're doing when you read. When I assign this text, I've always given students in particular a kind of a pre kind of warning about it. And I say, this is something that you have to take very seriously. You're going to have to read it more than one time. You're going to have to kind of sit with it and think through the things that are happening, and think about how you see those things reflected in our own society, but also think about, why is it disturbing you? And is there then some response that you should have to the things that are happening in the text?
The title, Parable of the Sower, obviously there's a biblical reference there. Why do you think she chose that particular title for this book?
I think she was setting up her trilogy, which it was supposed to be a trilogy: Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, and the third book was to be Parable of the Trickster, but which she never finished. But I think for her, when we think about who Lauren is, particularly as a person who is, excuse me, she's a gatherer, but she's definitely a sower. She is, I think, sowing a new way to think through how to deal with the society that she lives in. She sows knowledge and wisdom. She sows people. So I think that it's a very fitting kind of title, and the parable itself is really, I think a metaphor for the entire text.
Yeah. We start the book and we meet Lauren immediately, who carries us through this journey. And I was just thinking about just the week I've had, and I remember a couple of days ago, I get an alert on my phone, and North Korea has reportedly launched a missile toward Japan, and Japanese officials are telling people to shelter in place. And I'm here in Las Vegas right now, where there's been mass violence near where I'm staying, and it just reminded me that there's this sense, I think, for a lot of people that we're sort of constantly under threat. And that's the life that Lauren is living in a community where literally outside the walls, these things are happening and they're getting closer and closer to her and her community. What do you think Octavia Butler hoped to convey through Lauren? And why do you think she picked that profile of a young woman, young Black woman, to carry us through this journey and to show us what she intended to?
I think if you look at the whole oeuvre of Butler's work, she always has a young protagonist. It's always a very young person. It's a person of color. It's a person who's been marginalized, who has been underrepresented. That is the prototype of all of her protagonists. And I think in many ways, fiction writers often say something about, you're always trying to catch us telling the truth, right? So, in even though it's fiction. And I think for her, people are constantly looking to see what parts of Butler show up in Lauren. And so the kinds of questioning that Lauren does, the bravery that she has, the courage that she shows, I think those are many of the traits that are in the writer herself. I think she's doing many things when she chooses to shape a character like Lauren. One thing is really thinking about young people and the energy that they have, the solutions that are within them, the lives that they want to lead, that sometimes are, being impacted by the way their elders have lived their lives. And I think she wants to draw attention to that. But she also, I teach the book. Years ago, I created a class called Butler's Daughters. And what we looked for in the text were ways to think about leadership, because all of her protagonists step up to lead in really difficult moments, but in very unique ways. And so what is it that we can learn from a character like this? Are there leadership qualities and traits that we could inherit from a character like Lauren? So I think that she's saying something about our connection to our young people. She's saying something about our connection to ourselves when she chooses an unlikely character like Lauren, somebody who wouldn't normally have a voice, who now not only has a voice, but is giving voice to other people.
Is Lauren's leadership something she covets, or is it something she's forced into?
I think she accepts it, and she accepts it from the very beginning. She inherits it from her father, who's a leader. As much as Lauren is a typical teenager who is trying to create her own identity and break away from what her parents would have her be and do, she very much is like her father, who gathers people together, who represents stability for them in times that are incredibly difficult. So I think it's in her DNA to lead. But she also, yes, she accepts it, because it's not easy for Lauren, especially with her hyper empathy, to be in that position.
Hyper empathy is obviously the theme. Early in the book, I believe she talks about a school fight when she was a kid, and she essentially says, she said something that just made me stop when she said it, but she essentially said, as she was throwing punches or however it was, I felt every blow. And that just seems like so much. And I think a lot of people have the same questions about her hyper empathy, which is so important to the book and so important to her journey. Should it be viewed as a weakness, or a strength. And I also think there are these points throughout the book where people are attempting to, I don't know if test her is the right word, but to sort of see the limits and the boundaries of it. And that kind of felt uncomfortable to me, the idea of in moments where maybe she could have been more comforted, if you will. It was almost like a spectacle at times, I felt like, in certain portions of the book. But was it a power? Was it a weakness? And how do you think this affects the entire story?
Yeah, I definitely see her hyper empathy, as both. I mean, and all of our strengths are weaknesses in certain situations. And so for Lauren, though, I think one of the things that Butler points to, and certainly I point to as a teacher, is that empathy is not something we normally equate with leadership. Leadership is usually charismatic, incredibly energetic, is usually male. And you don't find those things in Lauren. And I think that to create a character who is not only empathetic, but hyper empathetic, and to craft that as one of her leadership skills and strategies, I think is incredible. Lauren is able to lead the way she does because she can't make a decision about someone else without it affecting who she is. And if more of our leaders would operate in that way, I think we would get a more balanced sense of from them of leadership, because it's not about, I make this decision and only you get affected. It affects me just as much as it does you in the same way. I have to be very careful to try to balance what it is that I'm doing. So I certainly see it as a strength. It's one of my favorite things about her. And, and I see it as one of her superpowers, is that she is able to not just put herself mentally in someone's shoes, but she feels what they feel. And that allows her to have to think very deeply and very carefully about how she proceeds and what she says to people.
I think that's so important what you said, because in a story like this, a young woman having that level of empathy, that's where the question comes from some people. Is it a weakness? And she actually talks about it a lot in how it affects her. When I think about her journey, and I know you said, Octavia didn't want to be a prophet. And in many ways, this book is a warning of, hey, there's still time. I also just felt like, and I got 3 girls, 14, 12, and 5. There was also a part of me that was wondering, is Octavia Butler also saying, shame on you for putting the next generation in this position, for leaving this mess behind, for not fixing what every generation says it's going to fix, fails to do so, doesn't put enough effort into trying to fix whatever the problem is, and the next generation is left to pick up the pieces. So there was a part of me that was wondering, was Octavia Butler also telling people in this generation, look at what you did, look at what you could have stopped if you would have understood what was ahead?
And definitely. I mean, I think that as you read Lauren's journey, as you experience it with her, you can't help but feel like this is so unfair, that she would have to do this, that her world would look this way, that all of those young people would have to try to figure out how to live now with what they have inherited from, all of their elders. I think definitely she's asking us to take a look at that and take a look at the legacy that we are leaving to the next generation. Before, those legacies were, more cultural or social or economic, but now they have devastating consequences, because it's also about the planet that we live on. And look at what we're doing, look at what we've left, and the way that we've lived, kind of thinking only about ourselves. Again, it goes back to that understand, being able to put yourself in someone else's position, even generations that haven't been born yet, and say, what water will they be drinking? What will the air look like? What will they inherit? Because we could not be a little less selfish today.
I'm at a place, Las Vegas, right now where water's rationed. People can only water their plants on certain days, and obviously wildfires and these things that are that are happening, it seemed like climate change was a big part of Octavia Butler's ambition. I mean, I know today people talk about climate change and it's somehow this polarizing issue, and there are people maybe on opposite sides. How was that received for this Black author in the early 90s who was talking about these things at a time when a lot of people just didn't want to hear about it?
Didn't want to hear about it and didn't acknowledge it. A lot of people didn't know about it. Again, the book is written in 1993, but it doesn't reach the New York Times bestseller list until 2020. And so while I think in literary circles, people understood Butler's writing and how powerful it was, she was not a household name. And I think it's only now that people see more of her, and still she's not. But at the time, again, it's considered more literary fiction, something you kind of read and study in very small groups. So lots of people would not have known about her. She wouldn't have been a household name, or something people were name dropping in 1993. I think part of what puts her in the public eye, and then again only a certain kind of public, is when she receives a MacArthur Fellowship. And once she has that and the notoriety that it brings, it elevates her in literary circles. But her book was not taught in schools even. The most you would find about Octavia Butler prior to the last 10 or 15 years might have been Kindred, which is a different kind of text, but still one, I think, that one that deals with the past rather than the future. So that it wouldn't have been things that people were talking about all the time where her work was concerned.
It's amazing how that happened, for an author, where 30 years ago is when it becomes most prominent and would have been most lucrative for her, I would imagine. I think about her dad in this book. I'm a preacher's kid, so I understand that life and that perspective. Everyone says Lauren's complicated. Like that's when you read these synopses, when you read these reviews of the book, we talk about the complications of Lauren. I think her father is arguably the most complicated character in this book. His messaging and his sort of sense of responsibility and duty is one thing. He's also a guy who's not afraid to pick up a weapon and advise everyone around him, hey, do what you got to do. How influential is he on Lauren? And I guess, what are some of the challenges with his character that he has to deal with as well?
Yeah, I think much more influential than Lauren would have admitted, like any 15-year-old when the book starts. Yeah. But Reverend Olamina, I think there are times I wish that we could be more privy to Lauren's memories of him, that we have more time with her to kind of remember him, because she's in the midst of it when a lot of this is going on. But he says things to her like, when Lauren tells everybody that they should prepare for the end, they should get a go bag. And he's like, Lauren, can't do that. And she's like, why? And it's not because he doesn't believe it. It's not because he doesn't know that she's right. He says that you can't bring people to the edge, to the abyss, and have them look in, right? Because then they'll panic and everything, they won't be able to handle it. So Lauren, her father, I think, is very much a product of his times. I think he's trapped in that middle space between what was and what is going to be, isn't quite sure how to make steps forward, knows he can't make steps backward, but that's still most familiar to him. And this idea that they're all kind of sitting around waiting for things to go back to the way that they used to be, he's trapped in that space, because there's a kind of comfort in that. But even he knows, I think, and we don't get to spend that much time with him, that it's not going to last. I think that is where Lauren gets it from. I think it's where she gets her courage from. She gets her ability to lead. She gets this forward thinking from her father, who has been a pastor, who has kept that community together behind that wall for such a long time, that she's very much like him, and she's inherited not just his traits, I think, but his duty and responsibility. She's just able to take it to the next. She's able to take it on the road. He's not able to take it out from behind that wall.
Her sort of detailed perspective on what is coming, what is happening. I mean, anytime something happens, the violence, the fires, Lauren is saying, hey, this is happening, you know, whether you like it or not, arguing with people about it. Was her father's attempt, I don't know if minimize is the right word, but was her father trying to protect her from her understanding things the way that she did? I mean, was he fearful of that almost in a way that this young woman would, you know, especially with her hyper empathy, if she fully understood the weight of this world around her, that it would be harmful to her in some way?
I think he's doing the best that he can. And I think he recognizes that he's not going to be able to protect them forever, which is why he tries to get Lauren to learn how to shoot despite the pain it might cause her, that she has to learn how to protect herself. Is why he takes them outside the wall so they can see a little bit of what's happening. I think that character knows his trajectory is that this is not going to last. Yet he can't say that because he represents what used to be. He represents what is solid, what is known. And he recognizes that he's not dealing with a group of people that he can push beyond that. And so it's just about preservation. So he spends a lot of time trying to get the kids ready, you know, for the kinds of things that they're going to have to face.
I was at San Juan, Puerto Rico, maybe about 10 years ago. And you go some places, especially the more upper middle class, there are walls everywhere. And when you get behind those walls, it's a whole different world, from the resources and just the way things look compared to outside of them. And I think this wall is obviously this incredible metaphor that certainly people in this country understand. My thought about it was the wall more important in its ability to protect the community within its walls from the physical threats or the emotional and psychological threats?
I definitely think it's the emotional and psychological threats, you know, that what the wall represents. Again, it represents safety, it represents the past, it represents what's known. It certainly does protect them physically for a while, you know, but Lauren is, you know, really clear that this is not going to protect us forever. So we have to figure out what we're going to do when the walls fall down and how we're going to be prepared to live outside them. But that thought is just too much for some of the people. And I think we see that even reflected today. The sense of, you know, so much of the text is about change and the ability to change, to manage change and what you do when change comes. And so for so many people, that is so frightening and so different that, you know, they cling to walls or want to stay behind walls because they can't imagine what it would be like on the other side. So
I think that
represents both.
I think that kind of what you explained is where I know I maybe get confused about Octavia Butler's messaging, because on the one hand, I can hear her saying there is still time for us to come together, rooted in our humanity more than anything, and to collectively decide to create a better place, to eradicate this world of some of its challenges and things that have existed for generations. I also hear her saying that you might not be able to do it here. Is the message that we have to go somewhere to create this new reality? And if so, is that somewhere a physical place, or is it a different place in terms of connection or spiritually or something like that? How did you process that part of it?
I think it's definitely about you have time, but it won't look like it used to look, right? Whatever that means to you, it's not going to look like it used to. Because remember, so much of what we think of, particularly in Western society, so much of what we cling to is built on top of bodies, right? It's built on somebody else's anguish or their time or their labor. And I think part of what she's asking us to do is to think about, how could that look differently? How could we survive? How could we thrive? How could we come up with a way of living with one another that doesn't mean somebody else has to suffer so that you live a particular way? So no matter how comfortable it is, no matter how much we're used to it, the text is asking us to think about what would it look like if we could figure out another way to live, come out from behind the wall and figure out some other way to still thrive, to still, I think be who we could be, but it won't look like it used to. And so the onus is on us to figure out what does it look like now. So yes, move to a different place in your mind, in your spirit, because the old place, it's not good for us in the sense that it can't support all of us.
Yeah. That makes sense. And it also, I think that's maybe part of the challenge for people to kind of overcome and what that new reality would look like. I started my career in journalism. I was a cops and crime reporter. So my job was sitting at the police scanner at midnight and running out to the scene of different crimes, in the city. So I saw a lot of really tragic images and moments and things like that. And I know that's a lot for people to process. And in this book, there are a lot of those images that make you go, "Oof, that's tough to hear about a child who, there was violence against their bodies, or a child is killed and those things." And I guess I always wrestle with how much of that is imperative to the story. And I would never question Octavia Butler, who is an incredible author, but I do wonder, why do you think for her, the imagery and sort of the details of it, the vividness of these really, really harsh moments to process, especially involving kids and young people, why do you think that was important for her to include and make a part of Lauren's journey?
I think it's, first of all, if you really think about it, her descriptions are not detailed. That is us, right?
That's fair. Yeah, it makes sense.
Wants us to do. And that is why her work lasts, right? Because, much of what she writes about, you can see between 6 and 9 p.m. on television, right? But she's not detailed in describing violence. It is more her, it is this, she says, 3 bodies were found, they're cannibals. She leaves you to fill in that gap and to really imagine what that's like. And I think that is the craft of her work, that she doesn't give us a blow by blow like we'd see on a movie or something. But she does that, I think, to push us into ourselves inwardly, to think about what it is that is still horrible to us about who we are as human beings and what we can do to one another. And if she's showing us and revealing to us, our demons, it is to push us toward our better angels. It's to push us toward our better self, to really think about, again, if we don't stop it, this will be commonplace. And we see that some of those things are already very, very common. And again, she's writing this book in 1993. If we don't stop it, this will be commonplace. We'll see this all the time, every night, every day, until we get numb. And what I think is so amazing about her work is that lack of detail really takes us into a space where you have to put this book down and walk away from it. And it's not because of the details that she shared with you. It's because of how deeply she pushes you into yourself to have to think about, who could do this? Why would we do this? And then don't stop there, though. Go further to say, how do we stop it?
Yeah, that's amazing, because I haven't thought about it like that. Yeah, the details are us. I think when I read some of these images, I think about different things, and that's what makes it more difficult to process. But I think you also said something that is really important. I think it's easy to read this book and to go, wow, that's a lot. But you, to your point, can wake up in the morning and look outside and see a lot of the same things. How much of that, in terms of her inspiration, was to try to get people to connect to their reality, which seems to be, to me, one of Lauren's greatest strengths, is her ability to sort of understand the moment, and despite her hyper empathy, be present in it, which feels like a really difficult thing for a teenager going through everything she went through to do.
Yeah, and I think that that's where, as a literary scholar, you might pause for a minute and say, is it really possible for the 16-year-old to do that?
Yeah.
So, but in that world, it is. And so, but she, again, I think it's this idea that we're supposed to read this and then talk to ourselves about it. Talk to other people, yes, to help process it and digest it, but it's work. That's why when people say, what is your favorite Octavia Butler book? It's hard for me to answer that because I don't know what they mean by favorite. I think they mean, what do I like? I don't like any of this, right? I don't like it, but I am compelled by it because it forces me to do the work that you have to do daily, not to become who some of the folks, the characters in the books are. You have to work against that. People think you have to work hard to be those things. You have to work hard not to be, many of those things.
Lauren's ability to create community, again, for someone that age, just feels remarkable. And it here in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, the world watched as people came together after George Floyd was murdered. And, I've been in this place for 20 plus years, and I had never seen groups come together and people sort of decide, wow, we're all human beings, let's march forward together. And in these really, really profound displays. And even though you wonder how long it's going to last, it happened. I saw it. I was there. But in the years that have followed, and you don't have a George Floyd, a lot of these things have broken apart. And here's Lauren in this book where I guess to me, when I think about community, I wonder how authentic it can be if it's rooted in tragedy and trauma. But I also admit that maybe that's the wrong way to look at this. But I did connect the two in thinking to myself, wow, all those people with George Floyd were ready to move forward together. But I'm not convinced they were acting on what they really wanted to do, more so just sort of reacting to the moment. And I wonder how you see Lauren's sense of community, how she's building community in relation to what's unfolding around her.
I think that, perhaps some of the starts and stops that we witnessed in the last few years are because people had other choices.
Yeah.
She doesn't have any. They don't have another choice. It is about survival, which I think is often what community is built around. I think in the best of circumstances, it's built around thriving. But I think it always begins with survival. That is how people link up and begin to trust one another. I know you want to survive, I want to survive. Let's help each other, kind of thing. But they don't have another choice. Folks who could start and stop in these recent years had choices.
Yeah. That community evolves and changes. It grows from what it once was, how it started. How different is this community from sort of the start of the book to the end of the book? And what is Lauren's role in that evolution?
I actually don't think the community is all that different. It is about survival, right? It's just that for Lauren's group of people, they can't depend on what used to be, and they can't fantasize that there is a structure that is outside themselves that's going to protect them or that has their best interests at heart. None of that exists for them. And so they have to do it all themselves. But the communities in the beginning and end of the book aren't all that different. The book, Lauren lives in Robledo, right, California, which I think is Spanish for oak tree. And in the end, she lives in Acorn, which is just a baby tree, right? And so it's the same type of community, but they've built their community around this idea that from the very beginning, they can't have hierarchies. It can't break along color lines. It can't break along religious, affiliations. It can't do that but there does have to be something that links them together, which is why Earthseed is so important. So that then becomes for them. People say right out, all of the critics have said for many years, if you read the back of the jacket, Lauren creates a new religion. I don't think she does that. I think what she does is what we always do, which is, sort of shape what we need so that we can survive. So, I know that it's like, oh, she created Earthseed, and, there are lots of really fascinating movements around Earthseed and how people see that and what it means. I think is incredible. But for me personally, I don't think that she's doing anything particularly that Black women haven't done. Is create a world out of nothing.
Yeah. Wow. I want to delve more into Earthseed, but you said something that I guess I've thought a lot about. Is Lauren more than a survivor? Because I feel like that's her. I don't know if strength's the right word. I don't know if gift's the right word, but she's a survivor in a world where everyone isn't surviving. But is Octavia Butler telling us she's more than that, or is that sufficient considering the circumstances that she's faced?
Oh, much more than that. She's more than a survivor because she's not just interested in her own survival. She's interested in the community surviving, and not just surviving. She's giving them something to rebuild themselves with. They have to have something that's bigger than themselves, something that links them together besides their need to breathe air. There has to be something else. After you finish breathing, what do you do? So she's much more than a survivor because she's interested in the survival of the whole.
She talks about Earthseed. Her father's a preacher. I can see where she certainly understands how to be an evangelist, if you will, because of what she's learned, even though she rejects, a lot of her father's perspective. She says God is change. And I wonder, in terms of her view on Earthseed and what she wanted to achieve, was it about giving people something to look forward to, something to have a sense of hope for in a world that was literally on fire? Or was it simply about choice? Is she simply saying, if you want something better, a better world, you can create it. You just have to be willing to take the steps to do that.
I think both. Definitely, I think it's both of those perspectives. And, because Earthseed is, and this idea that God has changed, for Lauren, so much of what went wrong was people's inability to change, inability to adapt to what you need to do now. It was always about trying to do what you used to do. And that shut them down from being able to see anything else. So adaptation for Lauren is really key in order to survive, because you have to live a different way, right? If we're really serious, we have to live differently. And Lauren is saying that it takes a certain perspective to be able to accept that and embrace that and carry that out.
How empowering is it for her as sort of, there's a bit of a reluctance in sharing, not understanding, not knowing how people will receive it, to being more willing to express herself and to talk about Earthseed and people accepting it? How do you think that affects the character Lauren as she becomes more confident, not just to me in sort of espousing the beliefs of Earthseed, but just more confident, it seems like, in who she is as a young woman?
Well, as she makes disciples, right? That she becomes more and more, not just confident, but powerful. And it's up to Lauren, I think, in those moments to make a decision about what she will do with that. Is it still going to be a collective community in which we're all making decisions together? Is it, as they give me more power, will I take it? And then what might I do with it if I decide to accept that? So she definitely becomes more confident. She matures. Look at the things that she goes through. She gets stronger, but she also sees her words affecting people's real lives. And that does give her a sense of strength and confidence and power.
Her brother, Keith, she has multiple siblings, but he in particular is different from Lauren. His journey is different. His perspective is different. what role do you think he plays, not just in Lauren's life, but just in this book? And what does he represent for, Octavia Butler, I guess, the message throughout this work?
I think he can represent many things. When you look at the sibling rivalry between them, he's the son, he's supposed to inherit the mantle, but Lauren does. So there's jealousy there as well. He's also a young man who's trying to come of age in a corner, right behind a wall. And we know what happens, when they're not allowed to express themselves and to find out who they are. And there are all of these, demands placed upon them, and don't do this. Don't hang out with those people. He rebels like many young people do. He just doesn't have room to rebel. That is a luxury, right? And he just doesn't have it because of the world he lives in, because of the skin he lives in, because of the space he occupies. He just doesn't have that room to expand and retract until he figures out who he is. And I think that Lauren becomes pivotal because he sees her as really a rival, and predict for their father's attention, for the mother's attention, just for the position she holds in the community. He too wants to be powerful. He too wants to do something great, but he doesn't live in a world that will allow him to do that.
I think it's such an incredible component of this book, because so many books have been written, so many movies produced where Lauren's the rebellious one. Well, and it's Keith who kind of emerges, and the reversal of that. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking of Octavia Butler in 1993 having the foresight, or just to be thinking about gender roles and just things like that, which are very prominent in her work. Why do you think that was important to her in what she did?
Well, I think just in her understanding of human nature, and her, because it's gender that's important to her. It's what we call race that's important to her. It's a class that's important to her. It's all of the isms, right, that she's dealing with in her work. It's just that she uses the science fiction genre, and she uses a young woman of color as the instrument through which we're going to examine that, the tool by which we need to sort of excavate our own feelings. And but she's like any other sort of literary thinker and a person who's invested in who we are as human beings, and literature is her tool. And it's just that her genre is a little different than Toni Morrison, but they're not doing different things.
I've thought a lot about, and I keep talking about the wall, but I feel like everything Octavia Butler writes, it's a metaphor that she's trying to convey to us. What do you think she was saying are the walls we have to address? I mean, what are those walls, and what do we do about them?
Class, gender, race, sexuality, the environment, is all of those things. Those are our walls, right? The same walls that we've been struggling with since the beginning. Those are our walls. And she's asking us to come out from behind them and decide, is there another way to do this? Is there a better way to do this that doesn't cause such tremendous suffering all around us?
Yeah. I know we talked in our conversation before this about, it's easy to see this as sort of a dark tale, and to sort of see the gloom and doom, and to feel like that's the message. But I know there's a message of hope. I know there's a message of, hey, there is a future here if you want it. How do you see the hope and the optimism that comes from this book? And how do you think Octavia Butler was telling us to seize that?
Well, I think I discussed with you an interview that I've read. A young man was interviewing her, and said to her, your books are so, there's no hope in your books. And she's like, they're full of hope, right? There's nothing but hope in my text. That is why she writes, because while it doesn't seem so on the surface, she's rooting for us. She has such faith in who we are as human beings and what we're capable of. And she's trying to take us to this dark place so that we'll desire to go to a higher place, to the light, right? She's trying to say, look, and again, remember, things weren't quite as bad as they are, when she's writing in 1993. But I also want to acknowledge that those kinds of moments have always existed for people. This is just that it's us now, right? But there are whole societies and whole groups of people who have experienced what Lauren has experienced their entire lives, from the very beginning. It's just that it's us, and we get to sit and read it very comfortably in our living room sometimes. So it seems so far away from us, but people have been experiencing this for a long time. So in that way, it's not a future text. It can be a history text. It can very much be a text of the present, because, so many people have suffered in these ways. And again, she's asking us, I think, imploring us to really think about what is it that we can do and change, and how can we be different in the moments we have before it's too late, before there's a tipping point and there's nothing we can do.
From 1993 to 2020, there are a lot of gigantic moments in our country and our world where it feels like things are falling apart. I mean, 9/11 happens, there are wars, there are mass shootings, all these really, really terrible things that are happening. But something about 2020 is when this book becomes a New York Times bestseller, despite 27 years of it being relevant to the world around us. I lived in New York City in 2004, back when they had the alert system, which would tell us, what level of threat we were under. And I remember that just being a very normal thing that you would just check every day. So I'm curious, throughout that time span of all the things that have happened, why do you think 2020 was the year when people began to read Octavia Butler more so than they had before, and it rose up the charts and became this extremely popular book?
I think a couple of things were happening. Of course, she had passed away, which raises the kind of level of awareness of her work. Many people who had been reading her work were taking it out of context. They were using it in communities to think about, what could they learn from it to help themselves. They had taken it out of the library and were really trying to use it in real life. But I think the real turning point is in the text when she talks about the president, and he says he wants to make America great again. And when people read that, I think they were shocked by it. But again, that's not a new phrase. Butler herself had, gotten that from, the early 80s from our president at that particular point in time. So it wasn't anything new. It's just that it caught people's attention in a particular way because it so resonated with what was happening in the moment. And I remember reading the book with students in 2018, and it was during the California fires that affected the Kardashians. And so the students came in, I remember they came in, they were just on edge, because they were like, do you know that the Kardashians hired a private firefighting company to save their property, but other people who couldn't afford it, their property burned? So that moment in the text for them, because they could see it happening in the world at that moment around something that they cared about, they will never get over this text, and they will read it over and over and over again because it spoke to them in that moment about something that they cared about.
If she were alive today, I think she would be very, very famous, very sought after, in a world of social media that just you're being quoted everywhere, interviews. How do you think she would have dealt with what would have been this incredible fame attached to this book?
I think she would have, done it with her unique style and grace. If you go on the internet and look at some of her interviews, and look at just, how she handles the press, I think she would have, done it, in her way. I think she's an incredibly private person, though. And so she would have been trying to shape the way she spoke into society in that way. She had a tool that she used. And I don't know whether she would have adapted the other tools now that we use in the same way, but I think that she would have been very cognizant of that, and she would have made very conscious decisions about how she wanted to speak into the world. And she really wanted her work to speak for her. So I don't think that she would have sought to be a public persona. She would have really wanted her work to continue to be what it is that people reflected on.
And then last question before we transition to the Q&A, the Octavia Butler Society is something you've been a part of that's really helped her legacy continue and thrive. How important has that organization been to sort of elevating the works and the life and legacy of Octavia Butler?
Not as important as I would have wanted it to be, because I can't split myself in another, 2 more people.
Yeah.
But it was very important, particularly when I helped to found the organization. I went to a couple of Butler scholars and I said, we are not talking to one another in the academy about this work. Everybody's working in pockets, but we're not doing it together. And we really need to figure out a place where we do this work together. And not only that, because her work was so important to you, could look at her fan base and look at the people who were reading her work, and they were doing what literary professors want everyone to do, which is take this work outside and make it mean something in your real life. So we also had to make sure we were trying to found a space in which it wasn't just for people, literary scholars and professors who spoke jargon to talk to each other, that it was a place where we will all come together. So in the last Octavia Butler conference, in all of them, we founded it so that it isn't just a regular come together, all ye scholars. It is everyone who likes her work. And my favorite, we did our first conference in 2016. And I love that one of the panels was a group of high school students who had been reading her work. And they contacted me and said, we want to come to the conference. And I said, not only do you need to come, you need to come and present. You need to present on your work and how you've read Butler. And at the time I was in Atlanta, and they drove from, I think, Greensboro, North Carolina. And I said, if you get here, I will get you a room in the dorm and you can present on what you've learned about Octavia Butler. So we've always tried to build that space in the work for everybody to come and speak, for everybody to be an expert, for everybody to be a fan, and really come and have that. And when we did the conference in St. Paul, I was so happy to work with community leaders who, while we would have one panel that was more literary and more scholarly, and then the next panel would be a community panel. And we did all that during COVID, so it was all online. But it was just such an incredible opportunity to see the way the academy can work with the community, which is what it was supposed to be doing all along. And we really wanted the society to be a crossroads, a space for that kind of work. I just am looking for the next person to come and take it over and take it to the next level. Because, I'm looking for Lauren. If you're out there, call me, Lauren. And so, because I really want it to grow. And it was my job to plant it, but it's somebody else's job to grow it.
Well, I definitely hope it continues to grow. You've obviously laid an incredible foundation. It's been an amazing conversation with you, Dr. Stanley. There are some people, who want to participate, and they have questions, which is pretty amazing. So let's see. Our first question is for Dr. Stanley. How was the novel received when it first came out in 1993?
It wasn't a bestseller. It wasn't until she wins the MacArthur Fellowship in 1994 that all of a sudden, and the MacArthur never tells you why you win. They don't say, oh, we picked this because of this work or that kind of thing, but everybody knows that it's because of her, of Parable of the Sower. After that, it elevates Butler to a certain level of fame and fortune. She's able to then, for the first time, not worry about expenses and be that writer that she always wanted to be, who could support herself with her writing. She's able to buy a house. She's able to take care of her mother. And those are the things that she talked about all along with her writing. But she's never been as famous as she ought to have been for her work. It's only now that you watch a television program and somebody's reading Parable of the Sower. It wasn't like that before. It was certain circle of people who knew her.
Man, it's amazing, because obviously today, these last couple of years, would have been lucrative for her in so many different ways. Our next question is, the Xenogenesis series predates Parable, but seems like almost a spiritual sequel to the Earthseed religion that has begun in Parable. Did Butler have a fascination with the idea of humanity and the stars and becoming something new?
I think so. Again, she's trying to push us to our best selves. And I think anybody who loves science fiction sees our best self as going beyond the planet, as we're bigger than this world that we live on. Yeah, because, from as I said earlier, that very first science fiction movie she watched as a kid, and she's thinking, I can do better than this. I can write science fiction. I can do this. I can write about these other worlds. That she's always been fascinated about that. And what's next? Trickster, if you've read Parable of the Talents, well, it's hard for me to talk about it because I don't want to ruin it for people.
Yeah.
But Lauren is successful to some degree with what she wants to do in the next text. But then Butler hit a little bit of writer's block because she thought, if I get them out in the stars, if I take humanity to the stars, then what? And she's thinking through that and can't really move much further. And lots of things happen, health concerns, those kinds of things. And she takes a break by writing another text, which was when she writes Fledgling. And for her, that was like her ode to the vampire novel. And even for Octavia Butler, when she's kind of tongue-in-cheek joking about a genre, she ends up writing, I think, one of the best vampire novels ever. And then had every intention after that to go back to Parable and to finish up the Trickster, but just was not able to. So yeah, her she's a kid who loves science fiction, really.
It's just, I would love to get her early reading list, the books she was reading as she was coming up. This next person says, I found it interesting that Butler wrote this book as a diary or journal. I found that interesting too. Did she ever talk about her choice for that writing style? Or why do you think she made that choice for such an intense story?
I don't recall. I'm sure that she does talk about them sort of like the epistolary kind of writing, but I think that part of it is so that we could see inside Lauren's head, right? Could get to know her in a different way. This is not third person. This is, up close and personal and first person writing for journal. And there is no more intimate writing than journal writing, so that you will know who she is, know her motivations, know she's not a kid who's just dreaming up something and hasn't really thought it through, but that she's working daily to think about what it's like to live better as a human being. And journal writing is that most intimate of writings. And I think that she chooses that in part so we'll know Lauren.
I think it's such an effective style. Like to me, it was Lauren saying, you need to know this, you need to see this part of the journey, which I think journaling does for us, and sort of how we depict some of the most important events in our lives.
It also, I think, is it is a nod to the biblical text, right? That those are letters and
Definitely.
sermons. It's sermons, really.
Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. The next person asks, how does Octavia Butler expand on how community is invitation and also the possibility of rejection by those invited?
I think community is invitation, but it is an invitation not to harm the other people in the community. And if you accept that, I think you're in, right? So it isn't exclusionary. It is to protect who is already there. And there's a time period in which you have to prove what it is that you are want from that community, what you're capable of, and what are you prepared to give. So I think that is her and her very, I think, intelligent way of inducting people into the community, is that she has to first decide, what are you going to do when you come in and we offer you our protection.
And you talked about survival. I mean, that being sort of the basis of what they were all experiencing. And that I would imagine that collective experience plays a role, a significant role in shaping that community.
Absolutely.
Next person says, Dr. Stanley, You noted near the start of the conversation that Butler writes about human nature as a way of asking us to be our best selves. Parable of the Sower, at the time she wrote it, was about the future. Kindred was about the past. What do you believe Butler was urging the people of her present time to do to become their best selves?
I think you answered it, and it is to look forward and backward, in terms of who we've been, figure out who we've been, what we're capable of, and then figure out what we can be capable of as we move toward the future. It's why I love her work, that you can spend so much time with the entire body of her work and really think through. She builds whole worlds for you. She builds generations for you. You can see the mom, the kid, the grandkid. I mean, she does all of that for you. So you can really spend time moving in and out of who we are as humans and really think through, what we're capable of, both the good and the bad.
Yeah. I love that she doesn't create flat characters, and that she's not afraid to create complicated characters, which is our reality. Lauren is complicated, and that's fine. And I really appreciate that Octavia Butler is willing to do that with the dimensions of the characters in this book and her other books. The next person asked, would you both share your reading journey with Parable of the Sower and what it means to you with each new reading? I guess I can start quickly on that. I read Parable of the Sower years ago, like so many other people. This is my first time reading it as a father, and I just see so much of Lauren and my girls. I have 3 girls, and I've just thought so much about in reading this book, what I'm leaving to that generation. Like, well, what am I doing to, pave the road that they're on, and what am I doing to also, I think, help them both embrace the reality, especially in a world where every kid has a phone now, and every single message is coming to them. They know exactly what's happening, but how do I help them filter that and not become so pessimistic about the world around them that they still wake up feeling like there's a reason to exist? So I think that's how it's been different for me. I think I read it as a novel when I first read it, as just a book to read that was good and everybody was talking about. And I think this time around, it feels more present and more real, and it feels more urgent to me.
I think for me, every time I read it, it is something new, but because I teach it, it is also something new as well. And I spend a lot of time trying to read the book with different kinds of people, can I come read this book with me? So it also depends on who I'm reading the book with as to what the experience is. But I used to read it every year. I don't now. So, I used to, like, every year, let me read through Parable of the Sower. And I remember one year I was just, and it would affect me differently depending upon what was happening. And I think one year I was just kind of really depressed after I read it. And I had a young kid at the time. And I remember her thinking, why do you do this to yourself? She said to me, why do you do this to yourself? And I thought, and I said, because I have to, right? I have to push myself to think through what she's asking me to think about so that I can be who it is I know I can be. And so that that's why I talk about the book as work. It is work for me.
Yeah, it is not a book you just sort of read and put down. It's a book you have to kind of grind your way through and, to your point, learn about yourself. I think that was part of her message. In the experience of, this person asked, in the experiences of the characters Keith and Lauren, what do you believe Butler was trying to say about both the nature of power and the outcomes of different ways to claim and enact power?
I think she's talking about the different ways that you can position yourself to be powerful, and it can be a way that grows, or it can be a way that has a very quick ending. If you continue into the second book, you're going to see that brother-sister relationship again differently. And I think we get a preview of it in Parable of the Sower, and we look at 2 very different paths for a brother and a sister in Parable of the Talents.
This next person says, if Octavia Butler were alive today, how do you imagine she might receive this work in today's world? Do you think that she herself still might be able to maintain that same message of hope, even in today's world, despite the fact that there are always cycles of moments that, as shared, make it feel like things are falling apart?
Well, it's hard for me to think about, because I imagine she would have written more work. And parable would have been just one of the texts that we were fascinated with, or that people were enamored by, or that she wanted to talk about. I can imagine that she wanted to talk about other things, other books that maybe she hadn't written yet, other than parable. So I imagine that she would want to have a larger conversation. I imagine that she would continue to be hopeful. I imagine it would be extremely difficult for her, particularly over the last few years. She would have had some incredible ups and downs, just like we all have. She would have been like, wow, look at who's the president. Wow, look at who's the president. I mean, I think it would have been an up and down cycle for her, but I think she was committed to holding on to hope and to believing that we could be our best selves.
Yeah, I would be fascinated to have that conversation with her. I mean, the work she did about the past with Kindred, and obviously the future with Parable of the Sower and her other work. This book feels like now. And I think that's why it's difficult for people to digest. It's easy to read about something that hasn't happened yet. I think it's challenging, but still easier for people to read about what has happened. It's more difficult to read about what's in front of you.
Yeah, it resonates with people because they can recognize it so much more so. Yes. People just, as I said, with my students who were talking about the wildfires at the time, people can see so clearly nothing is hidden in this text.
Wow. This next person says, Dr. Stanley, thank you for bringing this book to many people over the years, including me. Have people who have received this book shared with you how they've been changed? If so, could you share some of those stories?
Sure. I just this weekend was talking to one of my friends who's an art historian there in the Twin Cities. And I was telling her that I am starting, I'm looking at starting a new kind of major for students that has to deal with preparing for disasters, emergency management, that kind of thing. And I said, I wonder how an art class would play into what I'm trying to envision as a major for students. And she said, after I read Parable of the Sower, I created an exercise for my students, and they had to, like Lauren's go bag, they had to go to, but they were in a museum, and they had to think about what art would they save. If they only had a certain amount of time, could only carry a certain amount of things, what art would be in their go bag? And I thought, what an incredible assignment for students, for this art historian to have read Parable of the Sower and come up with that kind of assignment for her students and make it relevant to what they were studying, but also take them right back to being Lauren. So you're trying to figure out what you put in your bag, but you're in the museum. What goes in there? What do you preserve of the culture? What do you take with you so that it is preserved for generations? But yes, over the years, many people have talked to me about the text and what it's meant to them. And it's just, I'm just sorry I didn't start teaching it earlier, but in the early years, I didn't teach Butler until after she had passed. And the reason I didn't is because it was the thing that belonged to me that I didn't study. It was the thing that I did, that I didn't, it wasn't my work per se. But after she passed on, I thought, why are you not sharing this with your students? Like, why are you not teaching this? And then it became an integral part of what I did in the classroom as well.
How was that different? When you studied it, how did that change how you processed her work?
Because then I was gonna have to look at the things, that I thought were particularly weak about the text. I was gonna have to look at it in a very objective way, whereas I could read it as a fangirl when I wasn't teaching it, when it wasn't my work. But if I'm going to if it becomes a part of my work as a scholar, then I have to critique every part of it and think about things that even I didn't want to think about.
This next person asked, there are a lot of questions. Do you think this book can launch people into action toward change.
It already has. If you look at what communities have done with this book, if you look at the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, how the work has affected her personally as a community and social justice advocate, but also the communities that she writes about who've read this text. And you will see communities like in Flint, Michigan, or in New Orleans, places that have suffered devastation, coming together to read this text, again, to glean from it what they could use. What can we take from this to strengthen us, to help us in terms of who we are, how we survive, and how we build community after catastrophe?
Feels like we've had a lot of those moments in the last 20 years where so many communities have had to kind of regroup and rebuild. This person says, I have a question about the hope aspect of Butler's novels. Where do you see that hope really working in the entire Parable series?
Oh, you go to the end of the text, right? When they plant the acorn, when they're talking about Bankole is really, he's depressed and he's down because he's lost his whole family. But Lauren is like, we're gonna bury our dead, not just your dead, but all of our dead, and we're gonna start over. And I see so much hope in that moment. I see so much hope for who they are. I see hope every time they take somebody in off the road who becomes a member of their family and of their community and who wants to do right by them. I see hope there. I see hope in the fact that Lauren, who was so vulnerable, who could have let her hyper empathy kill her, decide that she's not going to do that. And instead it becomes a strength. So I see hope everywhere in the text.
I think you said something that also I've thought about in Lauren's journey, this principle that you can start over, that you can start anew, that you can build something up the way you want, no matter where you are, no matter what's happened. I think obviously so many BIPOC communities have faced that throughout their history, but I think that is a profound message in this book of Lauren's ability to say that we still can have something that's worth, I think, preserving.
And we can be human. We don't have to forget about our humanity in the midst of all this tragedy. We can still be human.
This next person says, Dr. Stanley, as a longtime scholar and teacher of Butler's works, are there still things that surprise you?
There are still things I'm discovering as I work on different aspects of her work. Especially because like so much of her other work is untapped, right? And so, the Xenogenesis trilogy, there are just so many other texts of hers, and and people are always surprised when, oh, what's your favorite Butler book? It's not Parable of the Sower. And so there's so many other aspects of her work that are yet to be discovered, particularly if I'm studying them, that I always find something new in her text. I'm working on a paper now, 2 of them. And, it's always amazing to me what I discover about her work.
This next question is, are there authors writing today that you believe are carrying on the work Butler began with Parable of the Sower and her other writing?
I do think that there are other authors whose work does the same thing. I don't know that they see themselves necessarily as carrying on Butler's work, but I do think that we have a number of really wonderful writers today who are opening up the science fiction genre to people of color and for people of color, about people of color in ways that hadn't been before, when she and Samuel L. R. Delaney were the only people really writing, people of color who were writing. So I do think that, yes, there are, but I don't know that those people necessarily see themselves, because I've heard them speak and not all of them see themselves as carrying on her legacy. And so I think, they have to kind of figure out if that's what they're doing.
This next person says, is there any particular interview with Butler that you would recommend reading or watching?
There's a book of interviews called Conversations with Octavia Butler, and I recommend that book highly. You'll get a synopsis of, I think it's maybe 10 or 11 of her interviews in that text. I think in terms of a television interview, there's an interview with Charlie Rose that I think everybody should watch. I think if you Google it, you'll find it. And because you can hear her voice, that incredible voice that she had, and just see her presence and see the way she handles Charlie Rose in the interviews.
I've watched that interview and it is profound. Her poise and just demeanor and presentation. This is really, really incredible. Before we get to these final questions, I want to remind everybody to take the survey if you haven't already, and don't forget about the Marian Key Book Club's live event. First time we're having an in-person event, November 3rd, 7, 8:30 at Minneapolis Central Library, and the event will be live streamed and recorded. This next person says, Dr. Stanley, a community's survival often involves someone else's non-survival. What is Butler's perspective on that? How to survive yet retain your humanity?
I think that she's asking us to figure out how can we survive and it not require somebody else not to survive? Like how can we all survive? That we are capable of figuring that out.
And then another question, when we are leading discussions of Parable of the Sower in a racially diverse group of readers, what wisdom would you share about how best to approach the discussion in her work?
Well, before you begin, figure out why you all are reading it together, and then agree on the parameters. We're reading this text too. What are you reading it for? And because I'm always reading it for a reason, and I'm always sharing it for a reason. So I think figure that out first, and then you can kind of lay the parameters of how you all talk through the text. Be courageous and be kind.
The next question, one of our last two, says, earlier in the book, Lauren speaks negatively about the modern time space travel and the colonization of the moon requiring the attachment to Earth as an umbilical cord. What is the importance of the space destiny besides hope? Moving past colonization that still persists in society, can we move past that without things getting as bad as they are in this book?
If I understand your question, I think that Butler's doing a couple of things with that. Yes, it's hope. Yes, it's a fascination with what's out there that we don't know. But I think it's also, and you bring up a very good point about colonization. We have to be very careful. And again, she's asking us to rethink things and think about how to do things differently. That were we to leave the planet, that we don't repeat the sins of our past, that we don't set things in the same kind of order and motion that we always have, which requires a change of mindset. Why are we exploring space? Why do we want to go to Mars? What are we trying to do? And I think those are questions that she wants us to ask ourselves.
There's the last two here. As the story unfolds in Parable of the Talents, Lauren faces decisions about whether to prioritize her own family or move to a safer city, or to stay focused on the community and accept the risk of harm. How might this provoke the tensions of leadership, especially in chaotic times? So
repeat the last part again.
How might this provoke the tensions of leadership, especially in chaotic times?
So I think that, one of the things that she's, the character helps to teach us is about our current understandings of leadership and how that might be different. And so it's really an exercise for us, or I read it as an exercise, to really think through how it is that, what is our definition of leadership? And why does it look the way that it does? And is it time for us to change it? And will it be inclusive when we do? Will we just replicate things that have always been? Or will we come up with a different way of thinking? Because what I love about Lauren is that she doesn't just she's not the dictator telling everybody what to do. She is trying to set up a system in which everybody has a voice and everybody gets to speak.
And then lastly, this has been an incredible conversation from a literary point of view. This person asked, who was Butler in conversation with?
who are her texts in conversation with.
It just says who was Butler in conversation with.
I would say, and I have a friend, I have to tell you, one of the reasons I founded the Octavia Butler Society is because I had a friend who was president of the Toni Morrison Society. And we used to get into these little moments. And I would say, actually, Butler was doing this before Toni Morrison. Do realize that. And I just thought, well, I just can't let there not be an Octavia Butler Literary Society. So I think that work was in conversation with each other. Certainly, if you look at from the 70s, if you look at the work of some of the like Kim Stanley, Robert Heinlein, if you look at some of the more traditional science fiction text, I think you will see that her work is in conversation with all of those, but it's a very different kind of conversation, because those conversations actually oftentimes replicated the society that we live in. It sort of strengthened the kinds of prejudices that we have and biases that we have, whereas Butler was always trying to break them down. I love to think of Butler in conversation with Toni Morrison's work. I especially like to look at Kindred and to look at Beloved, and look at those two texts and say to my friend, but you do know Kindred was published first.
Two obviously incredible authors. Well, this has been been amazing experience, man. This book club has done things I never thought possible, and I just see sort of the relationship to some of the books we've read to, who it's named after, my great grandmother. She was purchased at 14 years old as a slave, not much younger, obviously, than Lauren in this book. And I often think about where were those snippets of hope in those times, but they were there. They had to be, because she kept going, and she survived, knowing that maybe I would come, maybe this next generation would come. And I see Lauren, who's about the same age of Mary Ann Key, who this book club is named after. She was first enslaved that we know of. And she too is kind of searching for those snippets of hope. I think the message I get from the book is that, the sun isn't always shining as brightly as you want it to. But I think even if you can see that sliver of sunlight through the curtain, it's enough to keep people moving forward. And I really appreciate Octavia Butler, and talking to you helps me understand her even more, and understand, because, we talked about this. Like, I've thought a lot about how to read Octavia Butler, beyond just sort of reading the book, like, how do I read her work? And you've helped so much with that. So thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an incredible experience, and I'm really grateful, Dr. Stanley.
Well, thank you. I love to talk about Butler's work. So every opportunity I get to do that, I'm grateful. And thank you for founding the book club. It's so important that we have opportunities like this to come together and read. And when you think about Mary Ann Key, certainly she was a sower, and you're the seed.
I really appreciate that. And there's also a great sense of community around this book club, because it's not just me, it's Hennepin County Library and the Star Tribune and all these other partners, friends of the Hennepin County Library, who believed in the vision to come together and make it what it is. So thank you again. We really appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.
And thanks to everybody for watching and listening and tuning in.